Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the third session of the Leaders Workshop that we're organizing. And I'll do a quick intro before we let Arthur take the floor and share his insight and experience with us. So this session speaker is Arthur Lupia. He is an assistant director of the National Science Foundation and serves as the head of the NSF Directorate for Social, Behavioral and Economic Sciences. He's a Gerald R. Ford University Professor of the University of Michigan and co-chair of the National Science and Technology Council Subcommittee on Open Science. Arthur's research and related public work examines processes, principles, and factors that guide decision-making and learning. His efforts clarify how people make decisions and choose what to be or to believe when they face adverse circumstances. Arthur draws from many scientific disciplines to advance these topics. So he's been a John Simon Guggenheim Fellow, an Andrew Carnegie Fellow, and is a recipient of the National Academy of Science Award for initiatives in research. He earned a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Rochester and the social science PhD at the Caltech. So we're very happy that you're here tonight, Arthur, sharing your view on open science with us. And with that, I give the floor to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. And it's wonderful. It's wonderful to be here. I wish I could be there in person, but safety is the most important concerns. So what I want to talk a little bit about is the value of open science and some things we can do to increase it. But I want to start with what's most important first, which is gratitude for the work that all of you are doing. I know something about leaders of your organization. I've seen the rest of your program, and I want to express gratitude for the work that you do, really on a daily basis to try to use science and analytics and data to improve quality of life for people, to improve what we understand. It's important during a pandemic, but really all the time, to listen to communities, to find ways to get back to them. So I want to express gratitude for you, for the communities that you serve, and wish everyone good health. So that's where it begins, gratitude for service. And when I think of science and its role in society, I think of science as a form of service, as a way of clarifying for people the relationship between the aspirations and dreams that they have and the actions they can take. Or for others, science can show people how to get through, how to manage very big challenges, how to get through the day, or how to plan for the future. I also see science as a basis of innovation. And by innovation, I mean any process or procedure that can help us do something better tomorrow than we did it today. So I'm grateful to anyone who engages in this enterprise, but it's 2021. And with any enterprise of any consequence, there are questions. And today, around the world, science is being asked some questions. And one of those questions is, why should we pay for what you do? In many areas, there's this thing called the internet. And on the internet, many people claim to be experts about many topics. And so when they think about paying for research, paying for universities, sometimes the question is, well, why should we pay you to do this when I can just go to the internet and get a lot of information for free? A related question is, why should we trust you? In some cases, experts are seen as questionable. We may be well-intentioned and we may know things, but perhaps we're giving advice or explaining how things are related to one another in ways that other members of society might not want to trust. So I'm sure you guys read about the United States. You know that these questions are popular here, but I know that they arise in other parts of the world. In fact, they've arisen throughout the history of science, but I think the promulgation of the internet and social media has made them take on a new form. So open science, to me, one of the great values of open science is that it can help us answer questions like that. So what I want to talk about is open science and the public value of research. and how open science practices can increase the public value, can help us serve people more effectively. And I want to do that in two ways. One is by talking about the version of open science that's about access to research workflows. That's about access to how is it that we know what we know. So access to data, access to code, access to proofs, questions about replicability, reliability, reproducibility, and so forth. So the first lane is access to research workflow. The second lane is access to research products, publications, data, and so forth. So let me start first with access to workflows. Okay, so if you think about the role of science in society, one way to think about it is to say, well, it helps people. All right, so they look at us and like, well, why should we care? People have to make decisions. So decisions, any decision we make relies on an evaluation. The evaluation is, if I press a red button, what will happen? If I don't press a red button, what will happen instead? If I press a blue button instead of a red button, what will happen? So these decisions rely on evaluations. And for any decision we make, every evaluation by necessity depends on data or memories or evidence we have of the past. Until we invent time machines, we can't collect data from the future. So all of our forward-looking decisions depend on evaluations that we draw from the past. Evaluations are an interesting thing because we can base an evaluation on a lot of different types of material. And with the promulgation of the internet and social media, for many topics, there is no shortage of people who will tell you what they think, about causality or correlation or what's most important. So for many people who are trying to make very important decisions, the question isn't a lack of folks who will try and tell them what to do. It's that there are so many. And so people have to make a decision about, who do I believe? What types of information should I believe? So there are two common evaluation criteria. We don't say them out loud, but what I'm going to show you is two criteria that people often use to evaluate evaluations. So one is credibility. Is there something about this information that makes it believable or trustworthy? In many cases, we base a credibility assessment on our beliefs about the person speaking. Do they have expertise? Are they trustworthy? Are their interests aligned with mine? Do they benefit when I make a better decision? So credibility is one way that we think about all the people who are trying to give us information. Another criterion is legitimacy. And legitimacy is, are you coming up with your evaluation, your advice, your characterization in accordance with a recognized standard or principle? Legitimacy is really interesting in science because many of us are trained in different ways. We have access to different data sets. And sometimes, you go to a conference and you find someone you disagree with. And the question is, well, what do you do with that disagreement? Well, if I can understand how you have come, the procedure that you used to come up with your conclusion, and if you can understand the procedure that I came up, I might not agree with you and you might not agree with me, but I can understand how you got there. And maybe if you understand how I got where I am, that's the basis for a conversation where we start to understand and unpack, how do you know what you know? And through the mutual recognition of legitimacy, amazing things can happen, because that's how you can really learn from people who are different than you are. By contrast, if there's someone who disagrees with you and you think that the way that they have come up with what they know is completely illegitimate, it's very hard for learning to occur. So credibility and legitimacy are two important criteria in how people tend to evaluate the different types of claims that are made. So what is the value of our work in research and science? And one way to talk about it is a potential source of credible and legitimate evaluations. Right? One of the key things about science, from my point of view, is the idea of intersubjectivity. The idea that if I write a paper and I spell out how I chose a case and how I collected data and what analytic framework I chose and how I implemented it and how I interpreted things. If I write that in a paper or put it in appendices and you can read it, and you can, then the idea is, it doesn't matter that I was involved in the research. The idea is anyone who followed that set of procedures would come to the same answer. That idea of intersubjectivity is the key to scientific knowledge. It's one of the key attributes that we want science to have. There are other socially valid ways of knowing, like appeals to metaphysics, cultural references, personal testimony, where the truth of the claim depends on the person making it. The identity of the person really matters. But in science, right, for so many cases, what we want to know is a result that you found valid for me? And in that case, if you give me reason to see, well, your finding has an intersubjectivity to it, that anyone who would have conducted the research that you did would have come up with the answer, then I have a reason to believe it. So one of the bases of the cultural authority of science around the world is this notion that science is a potential source of credible and legitimate evaluations. So far, so good. So here's Richard Feynman, a very famous 20th century physicist who was at Caltech when I was there. I was not present at when this picture was taken. I was 10 years old at the time. But at the commencement address in 1974, he talked about what makes science valuable to society. And he said, scientific integrity corresponds to a type of utter honesty, a kind of leaning over backwards, is trying really hard to give all of the information that can help others judge the value of your contribution. And the key thing for us is that we're not supposed to only give information that leads in one direction. That's called advocacy. Advocacy is a very important and wonderful part of societies. But the idea in science is we're supposed to put the idea of intersubjectivity ahead of the idea of advocacy. So Richard Feynman talked about that, and that's a great ideal. And so now the question, if we had an ideal like that, how much of the potential that we have to provide credible and legitimate evaluations to society, how much of that potential is realized? And that's where the dark clouds come in again, because I think we all know at some level things can be better. And one of the reasons we know that is if you think about common academic incentives, today many researchers have strong incentives to discover and to publish. Publications are how you get jobs and how you get grants and so forth, right? These are very strong incentives. But we have weaker incentives to explain how the discoveries emerged. Excuse me. Weaker incentives to explain how the discoveries emerged. This is actually part of a bigger academic advancement ecosystem. If you think, myself included, what is it that helps us get ahead in research, get a job, get grants, get higher incomes opportunities, and so forth? Well, you can try and get, you can work for salaries, you can work for health insurance and grants, right? And there's all these other things that you can get if you publish, right? This is a game show host in the US, but he'll go at the top of a show and tell you all the things you can win if you play the game a certain way. And so in academic settings, we often have an incentive system that is built, not, credibility and legitimacy matter, but so many of the incentives are to try and do things that get these outcomes. These outcomes are necessary to live. These outcomes are, these outcomes give people opportunities. At the same time, they create attention. Because when we focus on these outcomes at the expense of credibility, legitimacy, rigor, reproducibility, it starts to threaten the meaning of individual studies. So for example, there's a practice called p-hacking, right? P-hacking is I run a statistical analysis. I can choose what type of statistical model to use. And if I select the model based on whether it gives me a particular result that I want, right? That p-hacking is one word for that. But the question is, now have I shown you a truthful representation of what I know to be true? Or am I showing you a version of reality that helps me, but maybe isn't as accurate as possible? So current practices can threaten the meaning of individual studies it can also threaten the meaning of a scientific consensus as a whole. Because if you know of the practice of publication bias, where journals may want to only publish significant claims. So if you and I run a study and we want to know if X leads to Y, if X causes Y, and it turns out that we find that it doesn't, right? If that type of article is far less likely to be published than another article that shows that A leads to B or C leads to D, then you get a literature full of positive results and all the null results are buried, right? And that becomes a problem, because when you then say, well, there's a scientific consensus that X leads to Y, and someone says, well, how do you know that there's a consensus? Right? Look at the published literature. All the articles say that X leads to Y. That would be great if every study that anyone ever ran led to X equals Y. But if all the studies where X doesn't lead to Y never see the light of day, then we have a problem. And imagine, just for an example, if publication bias had been occurring in the context of climate. One of the most powerful claims that we can make these days about climate, about the need to maybe take different actions, is the idea that there's a scientific consensus about the human effects on global climate change and how changes in human behavior can alter future climates, right? The power of that is based on the idea that there's a scientific consensus behind those claims. But what if there had been decades of publication bias and maybe only half the studies found that? I don't know that to be true, but the point is, when we engage in p-hacking and publication bias, right, in aggregate, it can lead groups of people to question the cultural authority of a scientific consensus. So the stakes are really high, and they're not just for academics. This is a book that I really like. It's by Richard Harris. He's a reporter in the United States, but he's very careful in talking about science. And he has looked at how decades of p-hacking and publication bias in medical literatures led to a really tragic outcome. So what happened is you'd have a bunch of studies that would say a particular type of treatment will reduce cancer. And so the government, funding agencies, pharmaceutical companies see the research literature like, okay, we're going to make this happen. We're going to build medicines, build devices, and so forth, so we can start curing cancer at scale. And so what happened in a number of cases, people would make these large investments. They would undertake clinical trials to make sure that the device or the medicine worked in reality as it did in the literature, and then they would find that it wasn't working. And the first response was, we must be implementing it wrong, because the literature said that this should always work. But the clinical trial, it wasn't working. So they'd spend more money and more clinical trials. Years would go by. And then in several cases, what people found is actually a number of null results were suppressed. And if we had known about the null results from the beginning, the outcomes of the clinical trial would not have been surprising. In this case, it's not just science that was set back. There were real people who participated in the trials and had their hopes for a cancer cure crushed. This was actually a matter of life and death, right? And there are many cases like this. The interesting thing is as unfortunate as those situations are, we have a way to improve it. And that is through the provision of greater clarity. And that, to me, is the basis of the great value of open science practices, right? In science, if we were willing to commit to greater clarity, right, greater exposure of how do we choose what we observe? How do we record what we observe and turn it into data? How do we categorize what we record? How do we analyze what we categorize? How do we interpret what we analyze? And then how do we present it? The more clear that we can be about every one of these steps, the more opportunities we give other people, whether they're from researchers in most cases or the lay public in some, they can actually look at our research flow. They can look at our workflow and try to determine how much of your conclusion depends on that particular workflow, or how much of it would be true for really any workflow. That's where the power of intersubjectivity comes in. trying to help people make an assessment of, is your claim generalizable? Does it apply to a case where I care about? The more that people are empowered to draw that judgment accurately, the greater is the public value of the work that we all do, right? So what is the value of our work? It is a potential source of credible and legitimate evaluations, but a greater commitment to practices that make the truth value, the validity, right, of the work that we do clearer to others, the greater value it can have. Changes we can make are right in front of us, but it's something we have to commit to, and a lot of people are doing it. So I've talked about access to workflows and how that affects the public value of research. Now I want to switch to the other form of open science, and that's about access to products, publications, data, videos, and other phenomena. Okay, this is also very important. In the US, two conversations are coming together right now. One is about access to publications. This is similar, I know, throughout Europe, people have been having that conversation in really interesting ways. And also the question of equity and inequality, right? If you think in the US, for example, about who has access to scientific publications and who does not, who has access to data and who does not, who has access to analysis and who does not. In many cases, the answer to those questions are the same as many other types of inequality in this country, right? And so if we think about the public value of research, that bringing those two things together helps us understand, one, maybe we should find ways to make data and publications and access more available in historically underserved areas and poor areas, right? But the other is to think through, well, how do we rethink open science in that way? Is this about just making publications and data available to universities, or is it about making it available to broader groups of people? So I think that's an interesting two things coming together right now. At least for us, what we're really trying to do at NSF is increase the availability of the things that we fund, right? Publications, data, code, and related materials. And at NSF for about a decade now, we've had a policy, which is if we fund your research and you have a publication that comes out of it, that within 12 months of the publication of that article, you must submit it to a public outlet that we have where anyone can look at it for free. So there's a public debate about whether 12 months is too long, but that's the policy that we have right now. We're working on expanding it to include working papers and maybe other types of materials. The National Institutes of Health, the Department of Energy, a lot of the government agencies have similar policies, all built around 12 months, because in 2013, the White House at that time put forward a memo saying that all large agencies had to do this. So that's the guidance that we work under right now. As a federal agency, we have to do what the White House and the Congress tell us. So one key focus for a lot of our efforts in increasing access is the FAIR concept. Probably many of you know it, but if you don't, FAIR stands for findability. So it's not just that I make an article available, but it has to be in a way that is easy for you to find. Instead of having to go through 90 layers of a website, can you find it in just a few clicks with a competent search engine? Accessibility. Once you find it, can you actually use it? Is it machine readable? Can it be made in larger type? Can the content be made available for people who have visual impairments? So is it accessible? The I is for interoperable. If we make it accessible on one type of browser, is it accessible on other types of browsers in other types of systems? And finally, reusability. If one person can access it and use it, is it of a form that other people can take what they've done and use it over and over again? So the FAIR principles are a key way that, at least in the US government, many agencies pursue open science policies where it's making products available. NSF has a public access repository, as I mentioned, has over 75,000 articles in it. 93% are available without embargo, and that's really just looking at what has been sent in the last year, the last 6 months. So we're working on making it easier. We're having PAR 2.0. We had a pilot last year that we launched that we've evaluated the data to make it easier to use. And we're about to run a second pilot now. We also regularly put out advice for investigators about things that researchers can do, not just NSF researchers can do, to make their data easier to find, easier to use. So if you were to type into Google effective practices for data, you'd see advice that we offer about how to do that. Persistent identifiers are a way here. I'm sure you guys are looking at this too. Persistent identifiers are keys to linkage systems where you can link sort of authors and grants and publications and other things like that. Metadata standards really matter so that the underlying way that systems identify different types of work can be linked, that increases findability and so forth. Machine readable data management plans we think are very important. A data management plan initially is about how are you going to store data. I like the idea of merging the concepts of data management plans and a pre-registration plan. A pre-registration plan, I don't know if everyone knows that. It's where before I get the data, I talk about the statistical analyses and inferential methods that I'm planning to use. And I put that in a public place. And one of the things that that does is it helps people understand how much of a finding that I have comes from an initial theory I have, and how much might come from work I did after I ran what I said what I was going to do, when I was just searching for correlations. Because before, when I talked about p-hacking, right, p-hacking is the idea of choosing a statistical model based not on its theoretical properties, but on whether it gives you a particular answer. P-hacking, it does not always lead to outcomes that are uninformative. The problem in publications is if I p-hack to produce a finding and I don't tell you that I did that, I represent it as, well, I had a theory and the theory leads to this result. Right? You'll hear and evaluate my claim differently if you think I produced the claim that way, as opposed to, you know what, I ran 500 versions of the model. One gave me a particular outcome, and I'm showing it to you to show you that it is possible to create this outcome. If I were to be truthful about that, you might say, okay, it's interesting that you can produce that outcome. Maybe let's think about what it means. So the big problem with p-hacking, of course, is not stating that. I think that if you were to roll pre-registration of your hypotheses and methods into something like a data management plan, many research results would be easier to interpret. Okay, so that's what NSF is doing. As mentioned at the beginning, I'm co-chairing the effort across the federal government to have US agencies try to align where possible on what we ask researchers to do. And it's just, if you haven't dealt with the US government, it's very decentralized. And so many researchers in the US complain that NIH has one set of rules and NSF has another set of rules and the Defense Department has another and so forth. So at least on open science, we're trying to coordinate. So we're working on repository standards, what attributes data has to have to be in a repository, what standards the repository has to have in terms of accessibility. Metadata characteristics, as I talked about before, this is an underlying language that allows people and machines to identify relationships between lots of research objects. Data management plan characteristics, as I talked about before, digital identifiers, and shared principles for data access. I know this is happening around the world. I know that, we're having conversations with many different countries, mostly in Europe and different parts of Asia and some South America. But shared principles that come from everybody's values, not one country sort of imposing their views on everyone else, is a really good way, I think, to try and coordinate to make things easier to find. And then there's the role of informatics. So I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to tell you about one of the best insults that has ever been directed to me. So I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, before I went to NSF, I'm in a group of people who are talking about the importance of open science. And there's a Nobel Prize winner at the table. And so we're talking about how important it is. And he's not convinced. And he looks at all of us and he refers to us as the transparency Taliban. He said, "You're the transparency Taliban." And I'm like, "What do you mean by that?" He's like, "What you're saying is religion. Like, show me evidence that the open science practices that you are talking about actually work." And that was a valid critique, right? I mean, so one of the things that I know there's this Rory research on research initiative that's circulating in Europe. People are actually trying to figure out what are the most effective ways to accomplish the goals of open science. Because just the fact that we think it's a good idea doesn't mean that we know how to implement it or that there aren't unintended consequences. So there are many roles for informatics, but one has to do with, evidence and causality about what actually works. Does greater transparency actually lead people to improve more accurate understandings of a scientific paper? And if not, what do we need to do differently? And a key part of open science is building the right infrastructure. So because particularly for young people, they're struggling to make their careers, and you want to, to the extent that we value these practices, you want to make it so sharing your work, sharing your articles can still help them, develop a career, a meaningful life, whatever it is they want. So evaluating ideas for infrastructure, I think, really matters. There are so many more. This is the beginning of the list. So that's the idea. And the great thing about open science is, we don't have to wait for somebody else to do it. These are things that we can do ourselves. Open science, I think, is really important because I think of science as service. I think the questions about should we believe you, some of them are, legitimate. And so anything we can do to make ourselves trustworthy, to make what we put out credible and legitimate, I think helps the public value of science. But achieving these outcomes requires us kind of being smart about how to build a new incentive system and the appropriate infrastructure. So with that, I'd like to thank you for the service that you provide through your work. And I'm going to shut off this presentation and take any questions that you might have. Thank you so much.
So thank you very much for a very insightful presentation about what's going on in the field in terms of also an NSF perspective. We've been discussing quite a few things today from a European perspective, but there are pretty many commonalities in a sense, the FAIR principle being one and some others. We have a crowd here, I'm sure, is interested in diving into some of the questions or issues a bit more deeply. If I may take the liberty to start off with a question from my perspective is, we've been looking into careers and career development of young faculty. And there we're having a discussion of how can we support young faculty in their growth, career growth, with helping adding these transparency of evaluation, appraisals, and basically tenure decisions to the game. What is your, as an organization like NSF, you see many of these projects coming, many of the career support mechanisms that you have and instruments that you have. How do you see the relation between the career support where open science adds to the game versus open science at the moment maybe also adds some more question marks for the young generation of academics to the game, where things are bit uncertain of how to play the game or how the game is being played in terms of evaluations?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and thank you for asking it. I want to answer a slightly different question, which I think is an answer, but just to put in greater context. And I don't know as much about how things are in Europe, so I'll talk about the US. In the US, there's been a steady increase in the number of PhDs produced. It's continued for decades. The growth in tenure track positions has slowed or flattened. So imagine a curve where the number of PhDs is going up like this, and the number of jobs available at universities is kind of flattening. If it's tenure track jobs, that's certainly happening. There's this other set of jobs that have occurred in the US that people are lecturers or they have postdocs, or they're this temporary employment, but you have a set of young people who are, moving from job to job, trying to find a place to land. So I see when I think about young people, I think for many of them, that's the main existential crisis that they face. And I think that the main service that we can provide to them, and again, I have to plead ignorance on whether the same thing is happening in different parts of Europe. In the US, a PhD is an amazing thing. It's an amazing opportunity to really dig deeply and try and find a new way to discover very important things. But I think we have to train people to take those skills and be viable in universities or in all other parts of society, whether it's in the nonprofit sector, in communities, or at companies, or for governments. At least in the US, for so long, we have really focused on, if you're going to make a good use of your PhD, you must have a tenure track job in a university. And if you haven't done that, you're second rate. And I'm not sure if that was ever true. I think that point of view more reflects the fears of the faculty rather than reality. But I think that now that it's an illusion that we can't afford anymore. We're doing these young people a disservice if we tell them that. And if we really believe in the power of the analytics of the methods that we choose, they should have more than one application. So I think, that's what I see as the bigger issue. So when I talk to tenure and that's what I really want to do. And I think open science practices really help there, right? Because now instead of being oriented towards your next publication, you might be oriented towards, is the work that I'm doing actually empowering a person or group to do better, right? So that's my top answer. But to come to the universities, so here, let me just say something skeptical. And I'm saying this because we're all friends now. If I try to influence the tenure and promotion standards of any university in this country, I'm going to be standing in the back of a really long line because so many people are trying to do this. And in the US, it's so decentralized. There actually is no federal agency that could tell universities to do this, right? So what I try to do for people in academics is not try to change the tenure and promotion committees, not because I don't want to, it's just I don't think I can. So I try to create awards, badges, grants, opportunities that are currency in the tenure system. So if you create all kinds of awards and prizes and grants for young people who pursue open science practices, right? And you get prestigious organizations to do that. And we've done that in the US. Now you have the young people notice that, the National Academy of Science, the Center for Open Science, right? They will give me a badge, they will give me a medal, they will give me a commendation, they will give me research money if I proceed in a certain way. That's been the way that I've tried to support it within academia. But for me, I think the bigger thing is if we tell the students that academia is the only lane, we're doing them a little bit of a disservice, and we're doing our countries a disservice because there's so many places where the type of work that we do can be valuable.
So that would kind of mean that science as a service has to be seen from a broader perspective, right? Less than from a tenure track or academic perspective in a typical career paths. Is that what I get?
I think so. I think so. For the people who are going into grad school, who are in graduate school, I just think we need to be more honest with them. For the people who are already in the tenure track, right, they've already sort of gotten in that track, right? And so the way that we've been trying to help them is to create, incentives inside the tenure system that alert people that the National Academy of Science and, that the American Chemical Society and the, American Economic Association, if they all are creating these prizes, which people are doing, it's not just the person who gets the prize, it's that these organizations who are, have some credibility are saying open science, particularly for young people, is a core priority of our discipline. That sends a signal that reverberates. What the tenure and promotion committees do with that afterwards, I wish they would pay attention to it, but I have very little control.
So should we, and just to close this one from my end, and then I open the floor to questions. So shall we, as Informatics Europe maybe, or as a society or a community, so to speak, more think about incentives in a sense of opening competitions in a positive competition sense for open science projects and award those? Because at some point, all these people, including us, are agents based on their beliefs. There's kind of reactions and opportunities that they seek. Would that be a way to, ignite a little bit more the way to open science rather than you know, you have to produce a data management plan. You have to produce, you know, the hypothesis and the data. You have to have the open data, the open source, and the open XYZ, which is placing quite some effort on it. On the other hand, what is the gain in the short term, right? Because people look at the next step in their careers. So I did more about opening different kinds of positive competitions and prizes, awards, and the like together as a community.
I think that's a good way to do it. And there are ways to do this that are actually pretty inexpensive. So when I was at the Center for Open Science, we actually came up with open science badges. And when an open science, you can look at them up on the internet, but so if we got, I don't know how many journals have joined now, but I think it's several thousand across a lot of fields. If you publish a paper and the paper meets certain open science criteria, the journal, when they, when you search for it, it'll not only have the title of your paper, there'll be the open science, that data is available, that there's a replication, that there's a data management plan, right? The badges will be there. And it turns out that in journals that have used these, even though they self-selected into doing it, there's been a causal effect of people following these practices because they want the badges. The other thing that you might be able to do, if you have an organization that already has a lot of credibility, and let's say you do a 2-hour webinar, or you do like some sort of webinar where you train people, and at the end of the day, you basically ask them to maybe sign that they endorse these ideas, or maybe they'll follow them, and you give them a certificate afterwards. For a lot of young people just starting out their career, the idea that they've made this commitment and that publicly people would reward them for it. Certificate programs, if you actually tie the certificate to a meaningful action, is a very inexpensive way to spread a message. And for so many young people, they have an existential crisis, like, will I be able to be a researcher tomorrow? And if you can give them just some sort of way to signal, look, I have some values that make my work reliable. There's so many people for whom that would make a big difference. And it doesn't cost a lot of money to do.
Excellent, thank you. So I'll take questions from the audience. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, well, there's another here. Yeah. Arthur, thank you for a very, very interesting talk. So I was intrigued about at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned products versus workflows, and products like, for example, papers or software. I mean, these more or less we know how to evaluate them, and I say more or less. But for workflows, I would be a little bit lost if I am asked to evaluate and compare workflows and say, because of course they are open for everyone to look at them and to study them. But in the end, if they are open and accessible, they are subject to evaluation and they are subject to comparison. So what's the experience of the NSF, or your take on how to evaluate workflows and how to compare them, if there is any meaning in comparing workflows?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So thank you for asking it. I think the most important reason to make a workflow public is just that other people can see it. And, you know, at a minimum, it's if you and I write a paper together and we say, if A, then B, and people want to know, okay, but I care about B prime. I care about B, some B prime that's not B. Is it the case that if A, then B prime? If we show them our workflow, they might be able to learn from it that, you know, given the cases we selected or the analytic framework, that in fact, our claim works for B and B prime and B double prime and P. So they might be able to find that. And then that would be great. They could take our work and use it. At the same time, they might be able to look at our workflow and say, oh, you know what? It applies to B, but not to B prime. But your workflow gives me an idea about how to pursue the relationship between A and B prime. So that person, instead of starting from zero, they can look at our workflow, and they should cite us, right? Citation is always a key part, but they could cite our workflow and say, okay, I looked at this. I want to understand B prime. So I'm going to take their workflow and make this adjustment so I can understand B prime. So I think that the reason for the publicity is for evaluating the fidelity and generalizability of the claim, but then also possibly, if it doesn't generalize, to help take the next step. But I don't, so that's how I think about it. I don't think there's any kind of a workflow, like universal workflow metric that makes any sense, right? It's more, if I want to read your work, I want to understand what it means. I read your paper, and your paper might tell me everything I need to know because the workflow might be in there. But if it doesn't, and you could show it to me, then I'd understand a little better. It's almost like if it were computer code, right? I mean, we can write computer code, and the computer code helps us make an airline reservation. And we might want to see, can we make an app that does reservations for buses or trains? And so it might be straightforward that the airline code works for the buses or trains, but it might not. But the only way, one of the ways we could figure out is if we actually had access to the airline code and could figure out, is there anything in this workflow that is specific to an airplane that wouldn't also work for a bus or a train? Having access to that code would let us get to the answer a lot easier.
Question in the back, Sharon?
Yeah, thank you very much for this excellent talk. I was wondering, can you speak to the question of open science and its relationship to the fragmentation or defragmentation of sciences in general? There is essentially all the grand problems of our societies are related to kind of a unification of different scientific disciplines. It's not about just one science. Literally every problem that humanity faces is concerning a bunch of different scientific disciplines and requires the collaboration of different scientific disciplines. So do you think that open science has a role to play in this defragmentation of science?
That's a very good question. So thank you for asking it. And I think it absolutely does. All of us are trained in different ways. And we learn certain ways of collecting data and analyzing it and doing interpretation of analysis. And so, we go to disciplinary meetings and we all have a very common way of doing it. But as you said, so many of the big problems of our day go well beyond the borders of any specific discipline. So now the question is, we want to work across borders. And how do we do that? And there are some things you can learn from casual conversation. But I don't know about you, when I've tried to work really with people who have really different training from me, I find that I have to spend a lot of time with them, and I have to spend a lot of time with their material. But if you and I were I don't know what your field is, but if you and I were trying to work together, and I could not only talk to you, but you said, well, here's an access to all the programs that I've written, and here's an access to how I choose here's how I choose cases. Like I could look at that and relate it to, oh, well, here's where it's the same as what I do, and here's where it's different. And then to the extent that we try to learn something together that neither of us could learn on our own, having access to the similarities and differences, again, I just think that would be an amazing asset to have. So I think it's a bit, I think of scientific methods a bit like language, right? I mean, we sort of have these different languages and there's similar semantic structures, but imagine trying to learn a language if all you had was like one 5-minute conversation a week, as opposed to being able to read books and see the ways different people talk to each other and being able to read sort of, here's how verb tenses are structured. And it's a very different thing. So I think that open science is really critical to vibrant, meaningful, interdisciplinary work. And I agree with you that for most of the big problems of our day, we really need that.
Further questions? Yes. Roberto?
Okay, so thanks again. Very, very interesting presentation. I had a little question about the incentives that NSF is going to put in place to actually further the adoption of open science. Let me be more precise. I happen to be part of the National Committee on Open Science in France. I wonder if you ever looked at the national plan we published a few months ago. For example, when you have grants coming from NSF, are you putting some language in these grants application that actually encourages or pushes or forces researchers to actually open up the result of the research, the data, the software, the publication? And if you are doing it, how is it accepted? What kind of policy support, political level support do you have in having these new kind of wordings in the application forms?
Thank you. No, thank you. That's a really good question. So I'll answer it on publications and data. And then for publications and data, NSF has had a policy for at least 10 years that you have to make your publications, any publication, freely available on a website that we run within a year of publication. So you have up to a year, right? So on publications, the compliance has to be 100%. And if you don't do it, you have a problem with NSF. We can't like go and arrest people, but if they ever come for another grant again, one of the criteria is what happened with prior grants. And if you're out of compliance, it's not a good day to be you. So on publications, the idea on data is the default assumption at NSF is that any data you create is publicly available. All right. So that's the default assumption. You can write in for exceptions, but the criteria for writing for exceptions are quite stringent, right? So the default assumption, most of the data that's created is made available. Now, one thing I'll say out loud is one thing that we have not been as good at, and I don't know where France is. So we require that it be available. We don't require that a repository, be very like we don't govern repository quality, right? So that that's something we should probably talk about in the future, and that's something the agencies we're talking about repository standards. But in terms of data, publications, code, the default assumption is if you're taking public money in the US, it's a public asset, right? You at some point have to make it public. So we're there on that. On like, we're not in the same place on like replicability. So the other lane in terms of workflows, that's really discipline specific, and because the requirements in say social psychology are very different than astrophysics. So we don't have an NSF-wide policy on what it means to share your code. But the default assumption at NSF is that if the US taxpayer paid for it, at some level, they need to have access to it.
Okay, thank you. May I add a follow-up on this one? So you gave a very nice example on the one study, which is a p-hacking study, and people were following on the cancer treatment and curement. But actually, the results were very, let's say it nicely, one-dimensional. And in accordance to a previous question here, would open access contribute, in a sense, also to avoid or to prevent maybe even scientific misconduct, because the results are out there and people should and get, check the data, check, the systems, check the hypothesis, and check whether it's a single dimensional result which has neglected the other important n-1 dimensions of one such of an experiment.
Yeah, I think open access can be helpful, but if it's only open access to publications, then we can't see what we can't see, right? So and particularly if an open access publication, if they still have an incentive to have publication bias and they're more likely to accept articles with positive results than articles with null results, you and I could read the journal, we'd have access, but we'd never know what got rejected. And moreover, people who wanted to publish in that journal, who knew that they were more likely to publish positive responses, might take the null results out of their paper, right? So there's part of an ecosystem. But if open access is tied to the idea that any data associated with any claim that you make in a paper must also be available and findable, right? Then I think that would change the game. And there's a thing in the US, well, you've probably heard, there's this top guidelines, the transparency and openness promotion guidelines, which allow journals to sign up for that. At last count, I think over 10,000 academic journals had signed up to different levels of it. So we're trying to move that forward. If you look up TOP guidelines, you'll see what it is. So I think open access helps if it's paired with open access to code, data, and so forth.
So in one of the previous sessions, we also discussed about the reviewing aspects of these artifacts. And there was quite a discussion in terms of this is increasing the burden, time, intensity of reviewers quite a bit. because it's not the paper, it's not the thing that we're used to, but it's also additional material that is just growing in a dimension that is beyond the typical reviewing load that we expected to get or that we signed in if we accepted some of the editorial positions, etc. So should we reward the reviewer activity much more in this cycle, in this ecosystem that we do now? So to assure that the validity, reproducibility of the results are even more trustworthy than they already are?
I'm going to answer your question, but first I need to show you something. I'll be right back. I have an NSF hat. This is my NSF hat. And this is me taking my NSF hat off. So what I want to say is not the view of the National Science Foundation. I think it makes sense to reward reviewers. And in part, I just remember, I don't know, again, what it was like in Europe, but when we were having the conversation about Plan S and open access, many of the publishers were talking about, we create so much value, like the researchers do things, but we create a lot of value through peer review. And so we should be compensated for that. And whatever you think of that argument, that's an argument that was made. My belief is that the reviewers do so much of the work there. So if we're going to think about a reward mechanism, the reviewers certainly ought to benefit from it. It can't just be the publishers, right? If you think of where the value comes, I'm sorry if I'm offending anyone. And again, this is not the view of the National Science Foundation. But I think it makes sense, particularly if we are asking for folks to include, attach appendices to articles, attach data links to articles. There's no sweet spot, because at some point, if we end up asking people to send 1,000 pages of support for a 10-page article, that might be an overcorrection. And I don't know the magic number. But I do think the idea, if we're asking reviewers to do more and we're telling ourselves that peer review is valuable, then at some point, I'll tell you, in the field of economics, this might not surprise you, they pay reviewers all the time. Now, whether you like that or not, it's a different story, but so ways of rewarding reviewers, I think, would be appropriate given their value.
There's another question from the front. Marian?
Yeah, thank you very much for your interesting presentation. Today we talk quite a lot about evaluating projects and research. Can you tell us a little bit more about how NSF proposals are evaluated? Are you using qualitative or quantitative indicators?
That's a really good question. NSF evaluates proposals with respect to two criteria, intellectual merit and broader impacts. But how that manifests is determined in specific fields, because again, the standards that social psychologists use to evaluate what's valid data, what's a valid research design, how do we assess causality, is very different than it's done in mathematics or astrophysics. And so we have we convene peer review committees within disciplines, within subdisciplines. They come together and we have this peer review process with respect to the two criteria. Intellectual merit is, is this design more likely to lead us to an accurate understanding of an important phenomena, right? So that's the one criteria. And the second criteria is, given the likely outcome of this work, what is the public benefit? Does it empower people to improve quality of life, create new innovations and so forth? So those are the two ways that we do it. What you might find disappointing is we don't require any part of the agency to weight them in a specific way, right? We don't, because we have this thing called LIGO, the thing that finds black holes, and the criteria that they're going to use to figure out whether we spend $1 billion to build the most powerful space camera ever made is really going to be different than a study where we try to find out whether social media makes people more prejudiced. So we have those two criteria, but we let the review panels decide, within the field, how they want to weight them.
Great. Other questions? Manuel.
Okay, thanks, Arthur. This is a sort of off-topic question from a dystopian point of view, and it's intended to be a little bit provocative. Let's assume that we are in a situation where most, if not all, of the science is open products, open workflows. Isn't that an incredibly valuable source of information for conspiracy theorists to take that information, twist it, and generate a huge amount of alternative views, not so, and fake news, and even worse things? So there is that danger that too much information can be used against the original purpose for which that information was created?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I count on the community of conspiracy theorists to do the most that they can to draw attention to themselves and achieve their objectives. I count on them to do that kind of regardless of what we do. And I think they could take anything we do and reinterpret it, right? So I have full confidence in their ability to manipulate anything that we put out. But I think that when I think about science, we can't just be passive, right? So there are a couple things that I talk about a lot in public, and one is strategic communication, and that is understanding how to convey scientific materials in a way that's true to the corpus, true to what we're studying, but also in a way that people can understand. And I actually don't think that you have to trade those things off. You just have to be kind of smarter about how you do things. And so there's this whole science of science communication, which I think is very important. But the other part of it is when we do p-hacking and we do publication bias and we hide things, we're giving conspiracy theorists like a leg to stand on. And I don't want to give them, I want to give them as little oxygen as possible. And so my hope is that if people in science commit to practices that lead to fidelity, that lead to accuracy, and if what people in society know about us is that when it comes to more clicks and more accuracy, we'll always choose more accuracy. If that's what they know about us, and the thing we know about the conspiracy theorists is that when it comes to that, they choose more clicks, right? I'm good with that, right? They're going to do what they do. But if we don't communicate effectively, and if we don't defend our, the way that we do things rigorously, that's how we empower them. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to give them any oxygen at all. So I think the more open we are, as long as people understand we're being open because we're trying to go to accuracy, that is our best. That's how we stay on offense against conspiracy theorists.
Wonderful news. So I'm running a faculty of informatics and economics and finance, and particularly economists and the people in finance have their top journals, and you're familiar with that field from your education and experience. I'd like to pose this question because it's really at my heart as a dean in a sense. Their culture is a top 5 journal culture, and changing this culture, at least from their perspective, is impossible, at least the arguments that they bring forward, because that's the culture and everybody adheres to the culture, and it's the top 5 journals and only the top 5 journals that count. How can we as organization or association or, NSF and others change this culture to the better, not in 10 years down the road, but earlier? Because I think it really needs a change, and a rather quick change, not to keep on with the old, let's say, coordinate system of the one or the other discipline.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's a really good question. So this is, again, I'm not speaking on behalf of NSF. I don't think that I can affect the value proposition of any other organization. But what I can do is any organization that I'm involved with, I can try and increase our value. And one of the ways that you break a top 5, right, is you create another organization or organizations that understands a type of value that it can create for people that isn't being created by the existing ways to do it. So when I've worked with organizations, that can be a hard thing to do, because it takes bringing in all your stakeholders and your leadership and trying to say, what do we want to do? what are we good at doing? And of the things that we want to do and we're good at doing, what are the things that hardly anyone else or no one else is doing, right? And once we understand that, the question is, are we committed to that? Are we committed to doing that? Is this a high value activity? And the more that you have your organization, like, okay, we're going to build our strategies and direct our energies to that, that's when you have the ability to really scale up in terms of the value you can provide. Then people who are looking for information, looking for expertise, if they find you valuable, they start migrating to you, they start supporting you. And maybe what you create is something that's so valuable that the top 5 still exists, but now you've created this new category where people like, when we want academic economics, we go over here. When we want an answer to a question about how we help a community, we go over there, right? I think that's an incredible, so that's what I try to do, because, every day is precious. And when I'm in organizations, like, I always like to think about how can we do better tomorrow than we did today. But if we try to pretend that, we can ignore competition, we can ignore like what we're good at and not good at, that gets in the way. So I think if organizations can be honest with each other about what are we good at, what do we want to do, are we the only ones that can do it? And then you commit to it. That's how you break the top 5. That's what I think.
That's very insightful, and I'm grateful for that comment to basically embed the top 5 or ranking of journals in a field, embedded within or around other values that we add to the game, because that's something I might even do for hiring committees like immediately, right?
Yeah, I can't do anything to affect Econometrica's value proposition, but I can affect the National Science Foundation's value proposition. So that's what I try to do.
So I think that's something also for an association like Informatics Europe is an important discussion. How can we add these values despite the ecosystem that exists, and we can't just transform from one day to another. Great. Other questions or comments from the audience? If this is not the case, I would like to thank you very much, Arthur, for sharing your insights and experience. We know you have a very, very, very busy schedule, and you carved out this time for us, for Informatics Europe. I think this was incredibly valuable for us, and thank you very much for doing this. And we hope to come back to one or the other occasion with questions or comments, or meet at one or the other place, maybe in the future in person. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sid. Thank you. I hope you enjoy Madrid. Thank you.
So have a wonderful remaining day, hopefully not so challenging, or in another dimension, interesting and fruitful. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Take care.